What's up, guys? It's Jan for Chess24. We return to Vaikanze, where the Tata Steel Masters is ongoing, the first super tournament of the year 2021. And as game of the day from the second round, I chose the encounter between the German number 2, Alexander Donchenko, and the world number 2, Fabiano Caruana from the United States of America. Neither side had a particularly successful round 1. Donchenko lost with the black pieces to Niels Grandelius. Caruana made a draw with white against Jorn van Foreest. They were both aching for a fight. Donchenko starts with 1 d4. Caruana goes for the Slav, d5 followed by c6, which we've seen him play in the candidates tournament, where he used it, I think, against Anish Giri and Ding Liren. And clearly had a lot of homework ready there. It's a somewhat surprising choice because, of course, Caruana is a rating favorite in this encounter. And many players don't play the Slav when playing for a win with the black piece because they're afraid of the exchange Slav. But probably Caruana rightly judged that Donchenko would not be looking to simplify, but would be looking for a full-fledged fight as well. And that is exactly what Donchenko does. He plays knight f3, knight f6, and pawn to e3. One of the very topical moves in this position. The other main line is knight to c3, which allows black to play d takes c4, as Caruana did, for example, against Ding in that candidates tournament in 2020. Donchenko plays pawn to e3. This was Anish Giri's choice in said tournament. And the players followed the game Giri versus Caruana for quite a while. Bishop f5 is a typical answer to e3, trying to develop this bishop outside of the pawn chain before going e6. Black wants to make sure this bishop stays active, which it does, but it is also a target on f5, and Donchenko goes for the main move here, knight to h4, trying to capture that bishop before black finishes development or finds time to, make a little luft for this bishop by playing h6, intending bishop h7. So knight h4, all of this is well known, as is Caruana's reply, bishop e4. Bishop g4 and bishop g6 also have a body of theory here, but bishop e4 has been the most topical choice recently. White should not take this bishop, because then after de his knight on h4 looks somewhat silly, but instead he should chase this bishop away, play f3, and force it to go to g6 anyway. Now the difference between this and the direct bishop g6 is that the white pawn is on f3, which has pros and cons. It can help when pushing g4 or e4, but it can also hurt the white structure since e3 is no longer covered, and plans that would be quite typical after the direct bishop g6, like takes and g3, look somewhat silly with the pawn already being on f3. So in a way, it's just, a more fighting line leading to sharper play, which obviously suits Caruana's style and what he wanted from this game. But also, I do not think that Donchenko minded this turn of events, leading to an interesting game against the world number 2. He goes for the same idea that Anish Giri popularized during that candidates tournament, plays the move bishop d2. Before that game, white players usually would go queen b3 here, black would play queen c7, and then white would play bishop d2, intending to capture and go long castles. But Giri's point when he did not go queen to b3 was, this queen is not that well placed on b3. It would much rather be on c2. Well, the black queen doesn't mind having to go to c7, so why waste time with queen b3? Why not just start with bishop d2 and now put this queen on c2 directly? And that is what Donchenko does. The problem he has, of course, is that this is hardly a surprise, since Caruana already faced this, and Caruana indeed soon deviates from his game against Anish, where in the candidates tournament he went for knight to b6. This time around he plays pawn to a6. Typical move for these structures. Black prepares to capture on c4 and then push b5 and c5. And you need a6 for that, because this pawn covers that square. So if you did this directly, b5, bishop e2, you wouldn't be in time to play c5, since there's no support from the a6 pawn. So a6 quite typical semi-waiting move that also has an idea. And white is at a bit of a crossroads what he should do. Donchenko goes for the very natural pawn to g4. Builds the bathtub, which is always a good thing to do. Hints at g5, also at h4, h5. And, you know, just keeps the tension. The alternative, which I'm not sure about yet, it would require deeper study, would be to play pawn to c5 here. You know, sort of closing the center, stopping d takes c4, and daring black to go b6, opening the position up on the queen side, but weakening his own structure. I'm not quite sure who this favors. It's a serious option. Computers quite like it for white, but it does feel a little unnatural to help black open the position up against the white king. So Donchenko not a fan. He goes pawn to g4. Caruana does what he hinted at. He takes, goes pawn to b5, bishop to e2, and pawn to c5. I should mention before we proceed here, instead of bishop e2, one very sharp, interesting option was to sacrifice his bishop with bishop takes e6. And after f takes e6, to go g5, intending to chase this knight away from the f6 square and then collect a bunch of pawns and try to, you know, embarrass the black king. But it seems like black is okay here. I let my computer run a bit, and in some line like this, the best it could come up with was to try to make a draw, give a perpetual check here with the white pieces, which probably was not Donchenko's intention. Still, interesting piece sacrifice was possible here. Didn't happen in the game. Bishop e2 was played. Pawn to c5, that's the black idea. And Alexander Donchenko with a very sharp move in this position. He sacrifices a pawn. He goes pawn to d5 to keep the c file closed and make the position even messier. Wasn't forced. White could just play a move like king to b1 when, I don't know, cd, ed, rook c8. Queen goes somewhere, knight to b6. The position, I guess, is roughly equal. But Donchenko's move leads to much sharper play. He goes pawn to d5. Black should not ignore this pawn and wait for it to capture on e6. So it has to be taken. Knight takes more logical than pawn takes, because after pawn takes, white has pawn to g5. Chasing this knight away and then taking here. The line would continue after b4, but it does seem sort of unpleasant for black. So no surprise that Caruana probably still being in book, although both players started taking a bit of time somewhere around here. So it's been clear. But no surprise that Caruana takes this with the knight. Knight takes, pawn takes. So black a pawn up and a nice central pawn. But white has bought some time before lines against his king could be opened. And now he has to decide how to proceed. How to try to fight against the black center of the black pieces. Donchenko goes for the move pawn to f4. First side, the most logical move here is bishop to c3, targeting g7 and d5. But it seems like after short castles, rook takes d5, and the queen unpins with queen c8, that black is just doing fine. The knight will come to b6, these pawns can advance, and the fact that white regained his pawn is not such a big factor in this position. It's more about the tempi, the initiative, and black would be doing pretty well in that race. So f4 is played by Donchenko. Has a very different idea. He wants to, first of all, restrict the black pieces, put this pawn on g5, and then two key squares would be unavailable for the black knight and bishop. He also wants to go bishop f3 if given a chance and target this pawn on d5 like that. Caruana, in turn, plays a very clever move, plays pawn to b4. This not only stops bishop c3 for good, which was still a part of white's plans, even if not priority number one. It also stops that after knight to b6, which looks logical, covering everything, the bishop can move to a5, pinning this knight. So b4, a very nice move, just as white could think about restricting the black pieces. Black also thinks about restricting the white dark square bishop with b4. Also for the future, hinting at c4, followed by c3. Here, Donchenko took a lot of time. I'm not exactly sure how much, like half an hour, weighing his options, and in the end he went for a very direct move. Pawn to e4, trying to open the center up further. There are alternatives, like this pawn to g5 move. I still believe was a very worthy option. Just taking these squares away and then going for potential h4, h5 or h4, f5. Black could also try to open the position with pawn to c4, let's say king to b1, with a very, very sharp struggle ahead. Bishop f3, bishop c1. Who knows? It's a total mess, but his pawn to g5 looks like a very interesting concept as well. Donchenko goes for e4, and Caruana in turn, after some thought, decides to keep the position closed, plays pawn to d4, which of course solidifies his material advantage, but also has some drawbacks in that it weakens some light squares, in particular the c4 square. In the live broadcast I thought that the most tempting would be pawn to c4, just trying to open the position up, but Peter Leko expertly pointed out that after king b1, c3, bishop c1, white still sort of coordinates, and it's not clear if black really achieves the weakening of this king that he tried to get. So Caruana plays d4, keeping the position closed for now. And Donchenko, not happy with the position being closed, tries to open it up by pushing his pawn to e5 and potentially e6. Computer, however, as you can see, by the arrows, or by the engine bar, I should say, not so much by the arrows, is not happy with his move, pawn to e5, because it weakens the d5 square. And Caruana's queen finds a nice home there after knight b6, followed by queen to d5, which turns out to be even more important than the black king getting weakened in the process. The alternative was once again to put this king on a safer square, go king to b1, and after knight b6 to keep control of this square. Computer says h4, intending h5, and he says it's still a mess. It's somewhat cryptic what white wants next, so I understand Donchenko did not go for this, but went for a more direct plan. But apparently it was very important to keep control over this d5 square. So back to the game. e5 played, knight to b6, pawn to e6, trying to open the black king up at all costs. Computer wanted to go queen e4 here, but you don't go e5 in order to play queen e4 and then exchange queens and try to survive this worse endgame. That of course was not Donchenko's plan. He goes for e6. So, arguing if this gets taken, there's trouble for the black king. Caruana reacts differently. He goes queen d5, says, give me a check, I don't care. He takes f7, and another instructive moment, he does not recapture this pawn, but he uses it as a shield for his own king. Goes king f8, hides behind it. And it turns out that white will need a lot of time to pose any threat to that black king, which is surprisingly safe on f8, while black has his own attack on the queen side with queen a2 or c4, c3. So the white position already not so pleasant. I thought the most natural move here was just b3, trying to keep this pawn and stopping pawn to c4, but then black would go a5, followed by a4, and it's still very tough to keep the position around the king closed. So Donchenko tries to do without this pawn to b3, and tries to go for the attack, go after the black king, plays pawn to h4, which has a very nice idea in one of the lines, which we'll see in a minute. But Caruana is not shocked and just takes on a2. He could also have played pawn to c4, when I think Donchenko's point was queen takes g6 in reply, attacking the knight on b6, rook to h6 would cover it and attack the queen. And here I believe he wanted to just play h5. Leave his queen en prise, but if it gets taken, all of a sudden the white rook joins the action with pretty devastating effect. So it shouldn't be taken. Computer, as you can see, is not impressed by any of this, just says, leave it where it is, play c3, and black should be winning. But I can understand that Caruana was not happy with this turn of events and just decided to grab this pawn. It's not only a pawn, it's also, of course, more play against the weakened white king. b3, knight a4, c4, c3 still in the air. Very hard for white to get too close to the black king. Donchenko tries, goes queen takes g6, attacking this knight, but Caruana finds a nice way to defend it indirectly. Plays pawn to b3. Now the knight can't get captured because of queen a1 checkmate. So Donchenko instead plays bishop to e1. Maybe potentially clearing an escape route for the king. But of course, things have gone somewhat wrong here. And Caruana, being the great calculator that he is, spots a very nice, very direct idea. He goes pawn to c4, preparing c3, but at first sight, leaving this pawn on d4. On prise, Donchenko takes it, also a point of bishop e1, now the rook is free. But Caruana has calculated further. Goes knight to a4, targeting b2, queen to b1, covering it. Here, the star move of the game, if you want to find it at home or wherever you are. Feel free to take a little break here and try to figure it out. What should black do? If you've come up with bishop a3, well done. If you thought c3 is the solution, not well done, because c3 would lose after queen takes a2, b takes a2, rook takes a4. All of a sudden, this pawn gets stopped last minute from queening, and black loses the knight, will lose the game. But bishop a3 is a much stronger move by Caruana, targeting the b2 pawn. It turns out there's no real defense. The tactical point is white cannot capture this because of b2 check, king to c2, queen b3 check. The king has to go here. Now the easiest seems to be queen c3 check, king d1, queen takes d4 check. Black wins. So this bishop cannot really be captured, but also can't be ignored as it's threatening. Bishop takes b2 check. So it's hard to come up with anything. Donchenko finds one last very pretty idea. He goes queen takes a2, b takes a2, and it looks like this pawn will just queen and the game is over. But he has one last trick, king to c2, clearing the way for this rook, so that if black were to get a queen here on a1, white would go bishop b4 check, takes, rook takes a1. And the position would be still pretty unclear, although black would have an extra piece with a bunch of pawns for white and this king. Black would still very much have to work. However, Caruana sees through that as well. Plays rook to b8, a much stronger move. And that pretty much ends the struggle, because now after b takes a3, black would checkmate with rook b2, king c1 and a1, queen checkmate. So the bishop can't get taken, but rook takes b2 is also a giant threat. There's just nothing good for white to do. Donchenko tries one last desperate idea. He goes rook d8 check to distract this rook from the b file. Rook takes d8, b takes a3. Now a1 would still be well met by bishop b4 check. But Caruana plays pawn to c3, interrupts that connection, now threatening a1. If white were to take this, black would just play rook to c8, pick up the bishop and win. And Donchenko instead chose bishop g3, but that has other issues. It allows this rook to enter. Rook d2, king b3, knight c5 check. And white resigned because after king takes c3, knight e4 check would win a lot of material, picking up this bishop, then this bishop, and black wins. So that means that Fabiano Caruana wins a nice game with the black pieces. Starts with 1.5 out of 2. While for the German number 2, Alexander Donchenko, in his first super tournament, he arrived at late notice, I believe replacing Daniel Dubov. So far, things aren't going well. He lost his first 2 games, but it's a very long tournament in Weißensee, so he has every chance to still make some noise. He played extremely aggressively against Fabiano Caruana. Got a very full fight. But I believe, looking back, he will probably regret his choices. Around here, maybe already pawn to e4, maybe this slower plan with pawn to g5 or king to b1 is more promising. And then after e4, d4, the computer really disliked this e5, e6, although it looked natural, and said play king b1, h4 with a mess. Anyway, a fun game. The world number 2 wins his first tournament game in the year 2021. Caruana also won the Weikantsee event last year, and he's clearly announcing his presence. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed these Game of the Day videos. I haven't been doing those for a while. And if you want to follow the event live, you can also tune into our English commentary with Peter Leko, Tanya Sachdev, and I also stop by there every now and then, every day at 2 p.m. European Standard Time, or whatever time zone I'm in. Thanks. See you soon. Bye.